What is going on, guys? It's Modded Warfare here. Welcome back to another PS5 jailbreak news update. So we have another disclosure on HackerOne from the Flow. He has done it again, essentially, and this one's a bit weird because Sony has made a huge mistake here. So we actually have a kernel exploit that has been disclosed, and yeah, there's quite a lot of weird stuff about this, but we'll get into all of that. So, of course, we already knew that the Flow did have a kernel exploit with his BDJ exploit chain, because at the hardware conference where he did that talk and demoed it, he did demo not just the Blu-ray drive exploit, but also loading a kernel exploit with it. You can see that right there. So, clearly, he had a kernel exploit. Now, I assumed he was probably using the 9.00 jailbreak, the 9.00 kernel exploit with the exFAT hack image that we use on the PS4. However, he doesn't use a USB drive in the demo by the looks of things to run that kernel exploit. So it appears that's not the kernel exploit he was using with his Blu-ray drive exploit. He was actually chaining a different kernel exploit, this one here that is in this disclosure. So I'll go into how Sony's kind of screwed up here in a big way, but we'll go into that. I'll read this out first of all, and then we'll get into the details. So it says the PS5 is vulnerable to this report here, which easily grants kernel access to an attacker. This vulnerability had been reported by me on the PS4 2 years ago when the PS5 did not yet exist. Thus, this should be considered as a new report and not a duplicate. I was able to use this vulnerability in conjunction with the BDJ exploit chain to gain kernel access. See this link here for more details. Impact: gain kernel access on PS5. So yeah, we essentially now have a kernel exploit on the PS5. Now, what's interesting about this is that the kernel exploit that the PS5 is vulnerable to, this report here, is actually a kernel exploit that was reported on the PS4 3 years ago. This is actually the kernel exploit that resulted in us getting the 6.72 jailbreak and also the 7.02 jailbreak. So that's going back quite a bit. This kernel exploit was actually patched in the PS4 on firmware 7.55. So 7.55 or 7.50 potentially. Was there a 7.50? Maybe wrong about that. It's either 7.50 or 7.55 that this kernel exploit was actually patched out of the PS4. That was way before the PS5 even existed. And yet for some reason the PS5 comes out and it's still vulnerable to the same kernel exploit that was patched in the PS4 years ago. So yeah, Sony really dropped the ball on that one. The fact that there's actually a kernel exploit on the PS5 that was patched in the PS4 years ago. And obviously it's been patched out now because this report was back from January of 2022. It's only been disclosed yesterday, September 20th, 2022. So yeah, it's been patched out by now. So in terms of what firmware version this kernel exploit was actually patched on, that's a bit hard to tell at this stage. My guess is that it's either 4.51 or 5.00 was the firmware version that patched this kernel exploit, mainly because, again, this was reported in January and it wasn't considered fixed or it wasn't considered resolved until April 14th, although they usually patch it, before it's officially resolved in the HackerOne section here. So I would say probably March at some point it was maybe patched. And of course 4.51 came out early March and 5.00 came out at the end of March. So my guess is that this kernel exploit was patched at some point then. So either 4.51 or 5.00. Now, according to the Flow, the BDJ exploit was patched on 5.00. And you can see that if we compare the two here, the BDJ userland exploit, you can see that it was marked as resolved on April 4th. And of course, the kernel exploit was marked as resolved on April 14th. So a similar time frame. So my guess is that they were probably both patched around the same time. So it's probably 5.00. That's my guess. That was the firmware that patched the kernel exploit as well as the BDJ exploit. Although, of course, there's a possibility it could have been 4.51. But yeah, that does mean that the minimum firmware that you need to have on a PS5 for it to be quote-unquote jailbreakable, obviously no jailbreak yet, but that kind of moves the goalposts a little bit. So instead of it being 4.03 being the minimum firmware that you need to have for your PS5 to be jailbreakable, it now looks like it's probably going to be 4.50 or 4.51, so an update or two higher which is obviously a little bit better for getting a PS5 that's going to be a jailbreakable PS5. So this is pretty good for advancing the exploits further on the PS5. Having kernel access should hopefully allow us to get the debug settings running on the PS5. It's still not going to be a full jailbreak, which is a bit disappointing because on a PS4, this would essentially result in a full jailbreak. Once you have a userland and a kernel exploit, you can chain them together to get the full jailbreak. But of course, on the PS5, you have that added security layer of the hypervisor, which restricts kernel access. So therefore, you're not really going to be able to do that much. It's greatly going to restrict what's possible, even with a kernel exploits chain on the PS5. We need a hypervisor exploit on top of this to get a full jailbreak. So unfortunately, at this stage, it's still not going to result in a full jailbreak for the PS5, but it should still allow us to do a little bit more than what we can currently do with the BDJ exploit. This should be potentially easier to implement compared to other kernel exploits in the past, because this is a known kernel exploit that's been exploited before on the PS4 by Slayersgorvy, who implemented the 6.72 and 7.02 jailbreak using this kernel exploit. And he's also the one who has created a implementation of the BDJ userland exploit as well. So yeah, it seems like this would be the perfect thing for Slayersgorvy to be able to combine the kernel exploit and the BDJ exploit, since he's essentially done this stuff before with this same kernel exploit. Although it is a different system, of course, the PS5, and this BDJ exploit's a different userland exploit to the WebKit exploits he used to exploit this vulnerability in the PS4. So probably not a like-for-like comparison, but it should be easier to implement than a brand new kernel exploit that has never been seen before. So also, the Flow has come out and said that he will reveal more about the PS5 kernel exploit at Hexacon. So this is the talk that he's giving at Hexacon, which we initially thought was going to be the same talk that he did at the hardware conference, but he's now coming out and confirming that there will be new information in here about the PS5 kernel exploit. So we definitely want to tune into that. That's on the 14th and 15th of October. I don't know if it's going to be streamed or anything, but hopefully, I'm sure the information will come out about it eventually. But you can see here that he is going to be talking about the BDJ exploit, and he's going to now reveal more information about the kernel exploit, since it's now been disclosed on HackerOne and he has permission to do so. So definitely keep an eye out for that one as well. So that's essentially it for this video, guys. We have a new kernel exploit that's technically an old kernel exploit, but is a new kernel exploit on the PS5 that we now have, that can hopefully be chained with the BDJ exploit by hopefully somebody like Slayersgorvy, so that we can get a better exploit on the PS5, not a full jailbreak, of course. And yeah, maybe it could be chained with this PS2 emulator exploit once that's fully revealed. And if that turns into a full userland exploit, then because that userland exploit works on higher firmwares, depending on what firmware version this kernel exploit was patched on, that could result in exploits on the PS5 on slightly higher firmwares than 4.03, 4.50 maybe, 4.51. So we'll have to wait and see. But that's what we've got so far for this update. So hope you guys enjoyed it or found the information useful. If you did, please leave a like and subscribe, and I'll hopefully see you guys in the next one.